Why changing your thoughts may not change the pattern. Thought often feels like the beginning because it's the first part of the experience we can recognize and put into words. But before language, we were already standing somewhere within experience. The body, breath, senses, memory, orientation, and attention were already organized in a particular way. Hi, I'm Veronica. I write, teach, and create reflections about conscious participation and what it means to be human. This space invites you to slow down, gather yourself, and return to wonder. This reflection begins with a simple premise: thought isn't the beginning. If you have ever changed a thought only to find yourself returning to the same emotional or behavioral pattern, we will explore what may already have been happening before the thought became known, and how state, attention, and the way we participate in life shape what follows. Let's begin. If thought isn't the beginning, changing thought alone may not change the pattern. You receive a message. Can we talk? 3 words. Nothing in the message tells you what the conversation will be about. Nothing has happened yet, but something changes. Maybe the body tightens, your breath becomes shallow, attention moves away from what you were doing and gathers around the message. Memory begins searching for context. Was there something you forgot? Did you say something wrong? Is someone upset? Before you have any more information, a thought forms. Something is wrong. It feels as though the thought appeared first. But did it? Before the message was received, you were already standing somewhere within your experience. You weren't necessarily conscious of the location, but the body, breath, senses, memory, and attention were already organized in a particular way. This is what I mean about state. State isn't simply a mood or emotion. It's the present condition of the field through which experience is being received and met. The message makes contact with that field. From one state, the words, "Can we talk?" may pass through without urgency. From another, they may activate the body, gather attention, call forward a memory, and become evidence that something is wrong. The words are the same. What changes is the state from which they are being received. By the time the thought "something is wrong" becomes available to language, an entire movement is already underway. The thought may be the first part of the experience you can recognize and put into words. But thought isn't the beginning. This matters because many of us have been taught to begin with the thought. We try to challenge it, replace it, quiet it, make it more rational, or transform it into something positive. Sometimes this helps. A different thought can interrupt a familiar pattern and make another interpretation available. But maybe you have changed the thought and still found yourself returning to the same experience. This doesn't mean you failed to think correctly. The thought may be expressing a state that hasn't yet been recognized, carrying an orientation that hasn't yet been examined, and following a pattern of attention that hasn't yet been met. So before trying to change the thought, we might ask, what was happening before this became a thought? We speak about thought as though it were one thing, but thought can take many forms. It can be a word, an image of something going wrong, a conversation rehearsed with someone who isn't there. Sometimes it's a memory that changes the way the present moment feels. Sometimes it's an imagined future that the body begins preparing as though it were already happening. And sometimes the body responds before the mind has found words to explain what it's responding to. Thinking isn't limited to verbal language. It can include remembering, interpreting, imagining, anticipating, comparing, associating, and attempting to understand. Much of this can be happening without our conscious participation. At any given moment, more is moving within the field of experience than we can consciously recognize. The senses are receiving, the body is responding, memories and associations remain available. Images, impressions, sensations, and fragments of language may be moving at the edges of perception. Attention brings something into the foreground of experience. Through contact with attention, one movement becomes highlighted. It becomes available to recognition. We call it a thought. This doesn't mean that attention creates the entire thought from nothing. The material becoming active may have been formed through previous experiences, relationships, memory, sensory impressions, repeated interpretations, and conditioning. Attention makes contact with that material. Through that contact, the material becomes activated within present experience. It's brought forward and it's given somewhere together. Maybe this is why thoughts often feel as though they appear spontaneously. We become aware of the form thought without recognizing the movement of attention that helped bring it into view. Thought is what we notice. Attention is often what we miss. Have you ever noticed that your body was responding before you knew you were thinking? What changed first? The thought, the breath, the sensation, or the direction of attention? In an earlier reflection, I asked, who are you practicing yourself to be? The question wasn't asking us to invite a better identity. It was asking us to notice what we have repeatedly thought, attended to, reinforced, and enacted until it began to feel like who we are. But before we can understand what we are practicing, it's important to ask, where am I standing? From what state am I meeting this moment? What is orienting me from here? We don't meet thought from nowhere. Just as a physical posture influences what the body can reach, resist, support, or receive, state influences what becomes available to perception, interpretation, and participation. We meet it from within a body, a history, a field of memory, and an orientation shaped by what we have learned to value, expect, seek, protect, and avoid. Let's return to the message. Can we talk? Someone oriented toward conflict may immediately wonder, what did I do wrong? Someone oriented toward responsibility may think, what do they need from me? Someone who anticipates rejection may think, are they leaving? Someone who doesn't carry the same associations may simply wonder, what do they want to talk about? The message hasn't changed. The location from which it is being met has. Orientation participates in what becomes significance. It influences what attracts attention, which memories become available, which interpretations feel immediately believable, and which possibilities remain difficult to perceive. We may consciously say that we value freedom while remaining deeply oriented toward certainty. We may value connection while being oriented toward self-protection. We may want change while remaining oriented toward what is familiar. We may value truth while giving greater authority to whatever preserves belonging, approval, or a known sense of self. This doesn't mean that our stated values are false. It means that the orientation is formed through more than what we consciously say we believe. When something unfamiliar enters your life, where does attention go first? Does it search for possibility, for danger, for the worst case scenario, for what might be lost, for what you might not be able to control, for evidence that the past is about to repeat itself? These movements can be called fear, resistance, procrastination, or self sabotage. But those names may describe only the surface of the experience. Something in us may want to move forward, while our established orientation continues directing attention toward what has preserved safety, identity, or belonging in the past. The resulting thought may feel like the obstacle. I'm not ready. This isn't the right time. What if I fail? What if everything changes? But the thought may be expressing the orientation through which the unfamiliar is being met. If we address only the sentence in the mind, we may miss the place from which the sentence became available. Many movements pass through the field without becoming central to our experience. They may remain at the edges of perception or make brief contact and move on. But when attention makes contact with a movement, something becomes activated and highlighted. An image, memory, sensation, impression, or fragment of language becomes recognizable as thought. Continued attention then gives the thought somewhere to gather. A memory calls forward another memory. An image produces a sensation. The sensation is interpreted. That interpretation generates another thought. The thought produces another image. Soon, what began as a moment of contact becomes a pathway. This is part of what happens in rumination. Rumination isn't simply the presence of many thoughts. It's attention repeatedly traveling through an established network of thought, sensation, memory, emotion, and interpretation. The visible content may change while the underlying orientation remains the same. You may think about a conversation, tomorrow's responsibilities, something that happened years ago, and a decision you have not yet made. These appear to be different subjects, but beneath them, attention may be repeatedly gathering around the same familiar orientation. I may not be safe. I need to remain in control. I must not make a mistake. I need to be understood. I have to know what happens next. The thoughts are different. The pathway is familiar. When your mind appears to be moving among many different subjects, is it truly moving in different directions? Or is attention repeatedly returning to the same concern through different stories? The more frequently attention travels a pathway, the more available that pathway becomes. What is repeatedly activated becomes easier to activate again. What becomes familiar begins to feel natural. What feels natural may eventually be mistaken for who we are. I am anxious. I'm an overthinker. I have always been this way. The thought has now become more than a movement with an experience. It has become an explanation of identity. What thought have you repeated so often that it no longer sounds like a thought? Has it become a description of who you believe yourself to be? The quality of thinking changes with the state from which thinking occurs. Thinking from a scattered state may become rumination, not because thought is inherently harmful, but because attention repeatedly travels through activated and competing pathways. In a gathered state, thinking can take on a different quality. Attention can remain in relationship with an idea without being consumed by it. Memory can inform the present without replacing it. Discernment becomes more available. The question isn't only, what am I thinking? It's also, from what state is this thinking occurring? Attention is often treated as though it belongs only to the mind. We speak of paying attention as a mental task, concentrating, focusing, or thinking carefully about something. But attention participates across the dimensions of experience. A sound reaches the senses, the body responds. Attention is drawn toward the sensation. Memory supplies an association. An image becomes available. Language begins to form. What began as sensory contact becomes recognizable as meaning. These movements may happen so quickly that they appear simultaneous. Thought then seems to have arrived first because thought is the part we can repeat to ourselves. But attention has already participated in bringing sensation, memory, emotion, image, and language into relationship. Attention is the bridge through which different dimensions of experience make contact and become consequential to one another. This is why attention isn't the same as awareness. Awareness is the capacity through which experience is known. Attention is the movement through which something within experience becomes active, prominent, and available for relationship. Awareness allows us to know that a thought is present. Attention participates in which thought becomes foregrounded, how long we remain with it, what it becomes connected to, and whether it is reinforced through repetition. When this movement remains unconscious, thought seems to control us. But it may be more accurate to say that attention has been conditioned to gather along familiar pathways. This isn't always a fixed sequence. Attention and the senses move in relationship. A sensation may draw attention, and attention may intensify the sensation. A memory may activate the body, and the body's response may make related memories more available. Each movement can strengthen the others so quickly that the process appears to happen all at once. When people struggle with their thoughts, they often try to manage the thought itself. Stop thinking about it. Think positively. Replace the thought. Distract yourself. Find a more rational interpretation. These approaches may interrupt the movement temporarily, but if the state, orientation, and pattern of attention remain unchanged, another thought may soon carry the same underlying organization. The words may change while the pattern continues. Yoga doesn't simply train us to produce or think better thoughts. It trains our capacity to notice where attention has gone, what has drawn it there, and whether we can remain in conscious relationship with what has been activated. This isn't control through force, it's restraint without suppression, regulation without rejection, agency without the demand that experience conform to our preferences. The question becomes less, how do I stop this thought? And more, what has been activated? Where is attention gathering? From what state am I meeting this? What is orienting attention in this direction? What relationship am I forming with what is here? A thought can then be recognized as part of experience without immediately becoming the whole meaning of the experience. Control doesn't have to mean forcing the mind into silence or refusing what is present. It's developing enough agency to recognize where attention has gone and enough steadiness to return to it. Attention will be directed somewhere. If we don't participate consciously in that direction, familiar patterns and external influences will continue directing it for us. This doesn't mean that the outside world has no influence. We exist in relationship with environments, systems, people, histories, and circumstances that genuinely affect the field. Conscious participation doesn't deny those conditions. It asks us what remains ours within our relationship to them. Can I recognize what has made contact? Can I notice what has been activated? Can I become responsible for what I continue to reinforce, even when I didn't create the conditions that first shaped the pattern? This may be one reason the breath is such a brilliant place to begin. The breath doesn't require us to create another thought about what is happening. It allows us to meet the organization of the instrument directly. The breath can reveal whether the body is bracing or receptive, hurried or settled, restricted or spacious. It can show us how quickly attention moves away, how forcefully we try to hold it, and what happens when we invite it to return. The breath reveals state before state has been translated into explanation. It doesn't tell us what to think, but it reveals the condition from which thought is becoming available. When attention is brought to the breath, we aren't trying to make thought disappear. We are giving attention a living relationship through which its movement can become known. Attention moves, we notice, attention returns, it moves again, we return again. This isn't failure. This is the practice. Through returning, we begin to recognize that attention can be drawn without permanently being captured. Something can be activated without determining our next movement. A thought can become known without becoming a command, a conclusion, or an identity. The next time a thought grabs your attention, pause before trying to change it. Notice your breath. Notice what is happening in the body. Notice whether an image, memory, sensation, or anticipated future is also present. Then ask, what was activated before this became a thought? Where has attention gathered? What is this thought connected to? What familiar pathways is asking me to follow it? You don't need to stop the thought. Begin by recognizing the larger movements in which it's participating. Maybe there is a moment, small, almost invisible, in which attention can feel the pull without immediately following it. That moment isn't insignificant. It's the beginning of conscious participation. This brings us to the opening movement of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is often described here as the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. This translation can make yoga sound like the achievement of a blank mental state in which thought no longer exists. But vritti doesn't refer only to discursive thought. It describes the movements or modifications of chitta, the inner instrument in which perception, interpretation, memory, imagination, and other movements of experience become organized. A nirodha need not be misunderstood as the violent suppression of activity. It points toward restraint, settling, and freedom from being ruled by automatic movement. The following sutras clarify what's at stake. When the movements settle, the seer abides in its own nature. Otherwise, there is identification with the movements. The problem isn't that movement exists. The problem begins when we cannot distinguish the movement from that through which movement is known. A thought becomes known, and we become identified with the thought. A feeling moves through the body, and it becomes a definition. A memory enters the field, and the past becomes the only available interpretation of the present. Yoga cultivates the capacity to recognize movement without being entirely organized by it. Stillness is often imagined as a mind without movement, but maybe true stillness isn't dependent upon the disappearance of thought. Perhaps stillness is the capacity of attention to remain gathered without being carried automatically by every movement that makes contact. A thought may become known, a sensation may be activated, a memory may become available. Stillness doesn't require us to prevent these movements. It allows us to remain in relationship with them without surrendering the whole field of experience to them. This isn't passivity, it's gathered participation. There's enough steadiness to notice what has been activated, enough space to recognize the pathway attention is being invited to travel, enough discernment to ask whether that movement still offers truthful orientation. The stillness isn't produced by defeating thought, but becomes recognizable when attention is no longer compelled to follow thought wherever it leads. Dharana, dhyana, and samadhi are sometimes presented as increasingly advanced things we learn to do with the mind. Concentrate, hold concentration, enter absorption. But this can make the inward limbs sound like mental achievements we produce through effort. We can deliberately place attention. We can notice when it has moved. We can practice returning. But we cannot force attention into genuine continuity, nor can we mentally manufacture samadhi. These become possible through the conditions established by practice. The preceding limbs of yoga participate in creating those conditions. They ask us how we live, what governs our actions, how the body is held, how the breath moves, how energy moves, how senses make contact, and whether attention is continually carried outward by everything that stimulates it. This is conscious participation in the state of the field. As the instruments become less dispersed, attention becomes more available to remain. In dharana, attention is placed and held in relationship with an object. As that placement becomes less interrupted, the continuity of dhyana becomes possible. And as that continuity becomes complete, samadhi becomes possible, not as something the practitioner forces into existence, but as the consequence of attention becoming fully established. We practice the conditions. The deeper establishment is what those conditions allow. Conscious practice doesn't cause dhyana or samadhi in a mechanical way. It prepares the field by reducing the conditions that continually disperse attention. This is why meditation cannot be separated from the way we participate in ordinary life. If attention is continually scattered through sensory stimulation, urgency, reaction, and familiar patterns, sitting still doesn't immediately make the field gathered. We don't leave the way we have been living behind when we sit down to meditate. We meet meditation through the state our repeated participation has helped establish. The practice of returning begins long before we sit down to meditate. It's present when we notice that the phone is in our hand before we consciously choose to pick it up. When we feel activation before building a story around it. When we recognize that attention has been captured without treating that capture as an identity, when we allow a movement to be present without following it to its familiar conclusion. These moments don't manufacture meditation. They prepare the instrument through which meditation becomes possible. A gathered state isn't dhyana or samadhi, but gatheredness creates a field in which the inward establishment of attention can begin to unfold. Thought feels like the beginning because it's often where language begins. But before language, there was already a posture within the field. This is what I mean by state, the present condition of the field through which experience is being received and met. The body was already participating. The breath was already revealing state. The senses were already receiving. Memory was already available. Orientation was already giving direction. Attention was already moving into relationship with what had made contact. The thought didn't begin the experience. It gave recognizable form to an experience already underway. This is why returning doesn't mean tracing the thought backward to find something to blame or correct. It means widening attention until we can recognize the state from which the thought became available. We begin to notice where we were standing, what had already been activated, what was orienting attention, and what the state made immediately believable or difficult to see. A thought can be real without being the whole field. A state can shape experience without becoming an identity. When we become conscious of where we are standing, we are no longer limited to managing the thoughts available from that location. We can begin to change our relationship with the field through which thought emerges. Conscious practice doesn't begin by demanding a better thought. It begins by noticing where we are standing. Can we remain present long enough to meet the movement before it becomes another conclusion about who we are? Thought isn't the beginning. And when we learn to recognize what comes before it, thought no longer has to determine what comes next. Thank you for wandering with me. If this reflection brought something into view, you're welcome to share what you noticed. To continue exploring conscious participation, you can subscribe or follow wherever you're listening and find more reflections and practices through gathering pieces of you. Everything is linked below. And until next time, slow down, gather yourself, and return to what is true.